Okay, so we are delighted to introduce Martin Wicks from the Labour Campaign for Council Housing and Defend Council Housing. Just letting a couple of other people in to answer the question, what's going on with council housing finance? More entrants. And there will be time after Martin has introduced the discussion for questions and clarifications and comments. There are two apologies. One is from Laura Fudge, who is who's got a Thurlow Lodge Aylesbury TRA AGM tonight, and Charmaine Graves, who is working this evening. Okay, so apologies done. Just to let you know that if you do ask questions, introduce yourself, who you are and what organisation you are from. But that I think those are the only introductions we'll do. So we've got more time to hear from Martin. Okay, so if you are not speaking, in other words, if you are not Martin, I am muting you and ask Martin to go ahead. Thank you, Martin Wicks.
Okay, well, this is obviously a big area, and 15 minutes is a bit of a pricey, but I'll get through as much as I can in the time available. Why is council housing revenue accounts underfunded? Well, we have to go back a bit. Prior to 2012, under the old council housing subsidy system, councils were given an annual allowance. That sounds like government money, but it wasn't. Basically, central government decided how much of the rent that councils collected they could keep. Many of them had to hand back some of that rent to the government. We know from the old House of Commons Council Housing Group that from 94 to 2008, councils received allowances of 60 billion, though in fact tenants had paid 91 billion in rent. That 31 billion difference was more than the outstanding historic debt, that is the borrowing for previous building programmes. So it's fair to say that council tenants were fleeced. That's why the House of Commons Council Housing Group, Defend Council Housing, trades unions, and even the Local Government Association called for the cancellation of this so-called debt when the Blair government consulted on its proposal for self-financing. Historically, tenants have paid more in rent than the debt acquired to pay for building programmes. Under this old system, councils were given a nominal debt. For instance, Swindon Council was said to have 12 million historical debt, but it was given a nominal debt of 30 million. So in part, your allocation was based on an assumed debt, which you didn't have. Another important factor was that New Labour introduced a so-called rent equalisation policy, which was designed to drive up council rents to the same level as housing association rents, around 20% higher, because they had to borrow money from commercial sources. That meant that tenants year after year had rent increases well above the level of inflation. As a result of these policies, more and more councils were finding themselves in what was called negative subsidy. In fact, in 2005, an Audit Commission report said that 82% of local authorities suffered from negative subsidy. Now, the government had a surplus from this process, more than 600 million a year. While some of this was redistributed to other councils, in the 4 years from 2008, tenant rents subsidised the Treasury to the tune of around 1.5 billion. And the Audit Commission predicted that if the existing system continued, then eventually all local authorities would suffer negative subsidy. This was clearly an unsustainable position, so a new financial system was developed by Labour, but implemented by the Tories in 2012, self-financing. Now, what was said to be overall council housing debt was redistributed amongst them. 136 councils were given a tidy little sum of 13.2 billion extra debt, and 33 councils were given 5 million debt relief. In a paper exercise, councils with extra debt were given loans by the Public Works Loan Board to the worth of that debt. Obviously, they had to service it to pay off the loans and pay annual interest, and currently that costs councils around 1.3 billion a year. Under the new system, councils had to draw up 30-year business plans, and the amount of debt they were given was based on estimates of income and expenditure over those 30 years. The amount they were given was supposed to provide them with sufficient funding to maintain housing stock to the decent home standard over that time. In reality, it underfunded them. Even worse, no sooner had the new system been put in place than the government moved the goalposts. They changed the criteria for rent increases from RPI to CPI, and they introduced the new so-called enhanced right to buy with higher discounts. Now, one of the criteria for determining how much debt each council got was an estimate of right to buy sales, from which they would make an estimate of how much rent they would lose over 30 years. But as a result of the increased discounts, there was a fourfold increase in the number of sales, meaning that councils lost a lot more rental income than was built into the financial settlement. Then, of course, as you'll know, they imposed a 4-year rent cut, 1% rent cut a year, meaning councils lost billions more. Now, under self-financing, there's no subsidy. The overwhelming majority of income, around about 93%, is rent and service charges paid by tenants. The last financial year, collectively, that came to about 8.6 billion income. Other than when a council receives grant, what it can do is, in terms of spending on its existing stock, is restricted to that income. Now, the rent surplus that each council has, after the cost of repairs, management, debt payments, is what a council has to spend on capital works. Renewal of key housing components like bathrooms, kitchens, roofs, central heating, and so on. Last year, councils with HRAs spent only 800 million on capital works. That's less than 10% of income. Now, today, with higher inflation, the financial situation has deteriorated. London Council's recently announced that they're facing a 700 million funding up over the next 4 years. Now, the shortage of funding of HRAs is such that the LGA called on the current government for a review of the self-financing regime. Why? Well, first of all, because the income that councils have actually received is far less than estimated in 2012. In addition, councils face new demands. The cost of safety changes following Grenfell, a new decent home standard, which will supposedly come in shortly, which will involve extra costs, and the big issue of decarbonisation of our existing stock. Now, the LGA reckons that the cost of retrofitting and decarbonisation will be at least 23 billion. That seems to me on the low side, because it comes out at only 15,000 or so per property, a lot less than the actual costs of retrofitting and decarbonisation if you go on the basis of recent experience. In any case, it's simply true that councils don't have the funding for such a monumental task. If you think of 800 million for covering the costs of stopping the deterioration of existing housing stock and all those other costs, then we are well short of the funding that is necessary. So the LGA is calling for reopening the debt settlement of 2012, something which the government has the power to do under the 2011 Localism Act. Under that, if there is a significant increase in income or expenditure, then the government can cut the debt to take account of that. So what can be done to address this underfunding? Well, firstly, part of the solution is the cancellation of the bogus council housing debt, which is currently in the region of 26 billion. That would instantly provide an extra 1.3 billion a year. Now, whilst that would be very handy, it wouldn't be sufficient. Clearly, we need more funding for renewal of existing stock, for decarbonisation, and for new build and acquisitions. So, with the likelihood of a Labour government later on in the new year, we need a campaign for adequate funding for the HRA. Of course, while you might look at the current Labour leadership and think we won't get anything out of them, we should remember that one positive thing we did get out of New Labour, despite its appalling record, in relation to council housing, was the major repairs allowance, which enabled councils to install double glazing, central heating, and so on. To a large extent, that was a result of pressure built by campaigning involving tenants, Labour parties, and trade unions. And that's what we need to try and do again. Now, obviously, whilst we need to be demanding an increase in funding for new build and acquisitions, I think the question of the demand of the AGL for a review of the self-financing regime is absolutely critical, or else we'll see a widespread deterioration of the condition of existing homes and conditions of living conditions of tenants. What's clear is that the current policies which Labour is likely to implement will not resolve the housing crisis. The question of underfunding of HRAs is something that they've not even addressed. So I think developing an understanding amongst tenants and campaigners for council housing of the financial realities that we face is important in order to build a campaign which demands the funding which is necessary, not only to stop the deterioration of existing council housing stock, but improve its conditions significantly. I think it's about 15 minutes, so I'll leave it there. Happy to obviously field any questions.
That was absolutely brilliant, Martin. Thank you so much for that. I've got so many questions in my head, but I will hold off for a minute to see whether anyone else wants to raise any issues or questions. So now's the time to raise your hand. Oh well, if oh, Liba.
Well, what you would suggest is best strategy for the campaigners to do to get them more money for the council housing?
Thank you, Liba. Any others? I think we'll take about three at a time, maybe. I've got one while people are thinking. So you talked about, Martin, you talked about the 10% figure, which I find mind-blowing. That, am I right in understanding you that out of our rents, only 10% is used for the upkeep of our council housing? 10% of council's income, which seems extremely low and kind of makes the facts that we all know about the really poor state of repairs, you know, puts that into perspective. And another question around rents and service charges going up. So just to comment, really, the local government association, like you say, are beginning to challenge current housing finance, and they're asking the government to review the debts. But I think I'm right in saying that one of the things that they're asking for is the right to be able to raise rents much higher than they're currently allowed to, which is a worry. I mean, it might seem like a solution from their point of view, but it's certainly not a solution for tenants. And the last question is around, you know, the right to buy and leaseholders. Now, obviously, leaseholders no longer pay rent, but they do pay service charges, and presumably that goes into the HRA. I wonder whether there's any data about the loss of income to councils because of the right to buy in terms of the rental income, and whether that's at all made up by the amount of money that leaseholders pay in service charges. Not just service charges, but, you know, are they fleeced when it comes to major works? Are they charged a lot more so that the council can fill the gap, that sort of thing? So you might not know the answer to those questions, but it's just something to think about. Paul, I believe you had your hand up. Paul, go ahead, unmute.
Okay, so it's just a question about the 26 billion of debt. My understanding is that from 94 to 2008, central government kept 31 billion. So 91 billion was collected in rent, only 60 billion was kept by local authorities. So does that mean that they're just carrying on collecting debt at a certain kind of interest. It seems as if the 26 billion in debt should have been paid back quite a long time ago. So I don't know whether that's a question. Just another explanation of how the debt works. Presumably, the thing that we're asking is that debt is written off. But yeah, is that a question?
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you, Paul. That sounds like a really important question. Okay, so Martin, can you come in and then we'll take another round of questions.
okay. Well, less than 10%, in fact, that's capital works. So obviously there's quite an expenditure on repairs, but I think it's important to remember that the purpose of the capital work, what the purpose of the capital works is. Under the Decent Homes Standard, each housing component has a nominal life, whether it's 30 years for a kitchen, 60 years for a roof, or whatever. And one of the problems is if you don't renew the key housing components in good time, then they obviously break down, and expenditure on day-to-day repairs increases. This is one of the reasons why I think there's a deterioration in lots of councils. Obviously, crap management is another factor, but it is less than 10% for capital works is a strikingly low figure. And just to reiterate a point, it's the surplus, the only money that a council has to carry out those capital works is the surplus after you take into account the cost of repairs, management, debt payments, and so on. That's an indication of the fact that we haven't got enough funding to carry out capital works on a sufficient scale to improve the stock. In relation to rents, I think housing associations as well. The London G15. We're actually calling for rent increases of CPI plus 1% for 30 years, which is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? From the point of view of resolving the funding problem for HRAs, then fleecing tenants is no solution, because it's going to make rents unaffordable for more and more people. So clearly, I mean, one of the things we should demand of a Labour government is that they end above inflation rent increases for a kick-off. Service charges, well, service charges are supposed to be they're supposed to cover the cost, aren't they? So I mean, councils shouldn't make any money on service charges. I mean, looking at the increases in some London boroughs, absolutely extraordinary. Down in Swindon, the council has managed to keep the charges down, and this year some are cut. Well, it's not clear to me. I don't have enough knowledge to know what is going on in London, but clearly service charges have been increased at such a level as to impoverish people, to the extent that they're now issuing, they're now threatening to kick people out, which is clearly unacceptable. On the question of debt, well, when you hear the term debt, you assume it is the result of borrowing. You borrow X amount of money, and then that's the debt which you have to repay. But that's not the case with council housing. It's not the case with HRAs. I mean, historically, there have been all sorts of different different systems. Yeah, but it's very. You would imagine that you would be able to trace what outstanding debt is from previous programs, but you can't do that because the Department of Levelling Up, as it's now called, doesn't differentiate between different forms of debt. And in fact, HRA debt, when it sits within a council general fund, is kind of dissolved into a common pot. So to find out how much historical debt councils had, you would have to go and look at every single authority in the country. But in any case, as that famous 31 billion figure shows, tenants have paid more than the historical debt, and that was the basis. I mean, for the LGA, not exactly a overly radical organisation to call for debt cancellation. You have to know that there's a damn good case for it. And I think one of the things that we need to bang the drum on when the new government comes into office is that unless HRAs are funded sufficiently, not only to stop the deterioration of existing stock, but to build a renaissance of council housing, then the sort of situation that you've seen, these horror stories about conditions across, well, certainly in some council areas, will be magnified somewhat. So I think this question of the LGA's review and funding of HRAs is absolutely critical for defending existing council housing, because if we can't do that, then you're not going to get a renaissance of council housing. Yeah, I think that's it. Have I missed anything?
Liba asked about how we can fight for funding for the HRA, but maybe leave that till the end. I've got Morag. Do you want to ask a question, Morag?
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep my video off. Sorry, I'm having the usual problems with connection. Yeah, I'm from Homes for All, and I think maybe people on this know that we've launched a joint 5-point plan for council housing, really in response to the all-party parliamentary group on housing last year, their inquiry into council housing. But it doesn't actually specifically raise the question of the debt. And I think even it's something that I'm not sort of clear about. And I think there must be a lot, because even as Martin, as you were explaining, it really seems so historical and in a sense a wee bit confusing. And I think it's something, I don't know, just whether Defend Council Housing could put out a fact sheet, and all, you know, like putting out, you know, urging either whether it's a fact sheet or a petition, urging local authorities. This is one issue that could make a huge change around repairs, because as you say, we're in a massive housing crisis. it's crumbling. I mean, even in the past week, there's campaigns springing up all over the place, which is brilliant. But for me, the priority still remains council housing as the only solution, and whether, again, as I say, could defend council housing, put out some kind of fact sheet and actually promote this issue, get some support around it, and, you know, at least begin to inform people.
Thank you, Morag. Any more questions or comments? If there's nothing more, I'll ask Paul to come back on those last 2 points from Liba and from Morag and wrap it up. And anything else, Paul, that you missed sorry, Martin, that you missed that you want to raise at this point?
Okay, I mean, in relation to Morag's comment, I think I can't remember. I think I may have emailed to you the Labour campaign for council housing. Bit of reverb. Has produced a pamphlet, The Case for Cancelling Council Housing Debt, which is, I think, even though I wrote it, is well worth reading because it lays out the historical basis of the problems that we face. It's very difficult to sort of explain these things in shorthand. But I think we can easily get across the fact that historically council housing has been underfunded. And when you talk about an important issue like decarbonisation, for instance, it's quite clear that if any government is serious about decarbonisation, if it's serious about addressing global warming, then it's going to have to provide some dosh because it won't take place unless there is significant grant for it. In terms of campaigning, well, I think maybe we need to put together a kind of simple bullet point document in terms of what do we need to campaign for under the new government. I think that would be helpful. And so that would include the review. It would include debt cancellation. It would include funding for decarbonisation. I think that we had some experience. Obviously, those of us old enough, we went through a long experience of new Labour government, which had an appalling housing policy. Councils were effectively barred even from applying for grant for social housing grant, and it wasn't until the crash for 2007 and 8 that they even allowed councils to put in for funding to build council housing. I think that a Labour government, on the basis of existing policies, is going to fail to address the housing crisis, and this is going to become obvious fairly quickly. And I think that there are sufficient organisations, campaigns to really ramp up the pressure. If you think about an organisation even like Shelter, which is demanding of all political parties funding for 90,000 social rent homes a year. If you think of the tenant organisations and so on. So there's the basis for campaigning. Perhaps we have to hone down the demands, but certainly we do need to get across the fact that housing revenue accounts now are grossly underfunded, and we need to campaign for sufficient funding, and that will include debt cancellation, to be sure. But maybe this is, I mean, obviously you as a group of people will determine how useful this discussion has been, but I think it's an issue that needs to be discussed more often in more places, because unless campaigners understand the financial realities, then you're not going to be able to put forward the practical proposals that can resolve these problems. Okay.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. I think we can all agree with that. If people think it's a good idea, I think we should think about where else, what other forums we might invite Martin to continue that discussion. Thanks ever so much, Martin. I put the case for cancelling council housing debt in the chat for people. It's an excellent document, and also the more updated your submission to the APPG, the need for investment in existing and new council housing, which talks about the historic debt as well. So thanks ever so much, Martin. And I will be in touch pretty shortly. And when this recording goes live, I'll let you know.
Okay, obviously, if anybody, if they read those documents, if they've got any questions, by all means, email me, and the more dialogue, the better.
Absolutely. Thanks ever so much. All right.